My name is Tim Smith, and I'm the historian here at the Adams County Historical Society. So today's program is about General John Fulton Reynolds. And I think I call it Reynolds to the Rescue because that's a chapter. I think that's a chapter in, it's been a long time. I've done this program years ago, but maybe it's in Edwin Coddington's book on the Gettysburg campaign. That's what he calls one of his chapters. But I want to talk a little bit about John Fulton Reynolds and the Battle of Gettysburg. I spilled my water already. On the morning of July 1st, General John Fulton Reynolds was in command of the left wing of the Army of the Potomac as it marched northward to Gettysburg and the fields of battle. Under his direction were the men of the 1st Army Corps, the 11th Army Corps, the 3rd Army Corps, and a division of Union cavalry under the command of General John Buford. That was about some 30,000 men he was in charge of. When he arrived in Gettysburg, he gathered intelligence, made preparations for the disposition of his troops, and sent word to General Meade that resulted in the general advance of the entire Northern Army to this town. In what he must have considered a crucial moment in the battle, General Reynolds rode to the 2nd Wisconsin Regiment and led them in a charge against the advancing enemy. As the regiment passed him towards the Confederate position in Herbst Woods, west of town, a volley was fired, and Reynolds was struck and died almost instantly. According to the New York Tribune, written right after the battle, the architect of the battle has fallen across its portal. Now, as wing commander, Major General John Fulton Reynolds was one of the highest ranking generals to die during the entire American Civil War. And, I thought it might be helpful to just, we say things like that to mention others who were high in rank that died during the American Civil War. And this is one of those things where there's not an exact answer because it depends on how you qualify what you're talking about. Obviously I just stated that not is Reynolds the commander of the 1st Army Corps, but technically when he dies, he's a wing commander. So that's a little higher in rank, you might suggest, than just a regular Corps commander. But in military parlance, they often assign the date of your rank as being senior to another person. So, of course, John Fulton Reynolds. Now, you might know that Brigadier General Nathaniel Lyon was killed at Wilson Creek, Missouri, on August 10th, 1861. And of course, at the time of his death, which he was leading a charge in battle, he was the commander of all the military forces, United States forces in Missouri at that time. So you really should count him as one of the highest ranking commanders. Oh, I turned my page too soon. Okay. James McPherson, killed outside of Atlanta on July 22nd, 1864, was a commander of the Army of Tennessee. See, he was actually the commander of an army when he was killed, a Union general. And John Sedgwick was killed on May 9th, 1864 at Spotsylvania, Virginia. Now, he was the highest ranking general officer in the U.S. Volunteer Army to be killed in the war. Although we mentioned Major General McPherson was in command of an army at the time of his death, and Sedgwick is in charge of a corps. Sedgwick he was the more senior in rank of the major generals that were killed. So again, you get to play around with this kind of stuff when you talk about this. You might know that A.P. Hill in the Confederate Army, Ambrose Powell Hill, was killed in a fighting at Petersburg on April 2nd, 1865. And of course, that brings up, General Stonewall Jackson, who was mortally wounded on May 2nd and died on May 10th, 1863, as a result of his wounds at Chancellorsville. And then, we have Albert Sidney Johnson, who was killed in the Battle of Shiloh on April 6, 1862. And no matter how you cut it, Johnson was the highest ranking officer on either side to be killed during the war. Now, of course, with Reynolds, it's interesting because there's a lot of conjecture surrounding his death. Since he died and left no personal records of his actions up until the time he died in the Gettysburg campaign, there's no official report of his activities. And so, a lot of people like to assign ideas to General Reynolds or to give you their version of what his plan was. And some of these things are just outright speculation. And I even wrote it down here. I am not a fan of speculation. But a lot of people do it. And they assign things to Reynolds like I don't know when I started hating this idea, but I absolutely hate the concept that people will push that Reynolds is riding to Gettysburg and looks over and sees Cemetery Hill. Yeah. We're going to fight a delaying action out there west of town. And then at a prearranged moment, we'll all fall back to Cemetery Hill and we'll rally on that hill. I hate that. And there's absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. Anyway, maybe I'll get into that in a minute. I'm getting too fired up. So if you ask me, Reynolds is trying to win the battle on July 1st. He's not trying to, hold the enemy back and then fall back through town. Now, I guess I'll talk about it now. Some people will suggest that, according to Stephen Weld, who's an aide of his, he sent to Taneytown, Maryland to give General Meade a message that we need to preserve the heights south of town and we'll barricade the streets if necessary and fall back to that position. And the message is not exactly written like that. If you ask me, the gist of it is by the morning of July 1st, Reynolds realizes that Robert E. Lee's army is concentrating on the road hub at Gettysburg. And if we allow the Southern Army to concentrate on the road hub, then Lee's army will be very dangerous. So the purpose of fighting in the fields north and west of the town is to keep Robert E. Lee from concentrating at the road hub, not from getting the hills south of town first. And then I'm sure Reynolds has this vision that on the second and third day, Robert E. Lee will attack the Northern Army positioned on those hills south of town and be defeated, with all this foresight. Anyway, the point is that since Reynolds dies, it has allowed people who like to speculate to, give a lot of reasons to why Reynolds does this or that on the first day of the battle. That's, I guess, my only real point. So a little bit about General Reynolds. And I wanted to say that in our presentation here, what I wanted to do instead of just speculating about Reynolds and what he's thinking on July 1st is to give some account of the other people who interacted with Reynolds during the final day of his life and give their accounts of him and talk about that. And a lot of those accounts, of course, are based upon the civilian accounts that we've collected at the Adams County Historical Society. So our slant on it is always going to be from the local people and what they thought about Reynolds and the battle. And of course, the local people are going to be big fans of Reynolds. Another thing about Reynolds, and you guys can't see it, she's got a Reynolds t-shirt on. The other thing about Reynolds, have you ever noticed that Reynolds is assigned qualities that he's assigned in his obituaries for things he would have done had he not died. I hope that in my obituary, I'm given credit for things that I was thinking about doing, but I never did. Like, if he would not have died, he would have been, the greatest general of the American Civil War. He would have done this, or he would have, I just find that very fascinating that he's given these qualities. Not that I'm going to say anything bad about Reynolds. I like Reynolds. First of all, you should know that Reynolds is born in 1820, September, I have September 20th, 1820, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he's one of 11 children. He was appointed to West Point by a friend of his father's in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a United States Senator named James Buchanan. He graduated in 1841. He fought in the Mexican War, and he served in the pre-war armies in different forts all around the country, and of course ended up in California just before the Civil War. We'll talk about it in a minute. Oh, I have to mention this. This is my family tree. Maybe I'm a little bit partial. I am related to General John Fulton Reynolds. And I don't know if you can see on the thing underneath of it, but there's a thing you can push on Ancestry that tells you how you're related. General Reynolds is my second cousin twice removed of the wife of my first cousin 7 times removed. I am really closely related to General Reynolds. Of course, I'm sure Reynolds didn't have children. So, you can't be directly related to General Reynolds. You have to be related to one of his brothers and sisters. And I think I'm related to like an uncle that married into our family or something like that. Okay, but I did go to the trouble of putting him on my tree and connecting him to me so I could figure out exactly how I'm related. Now, I wanted to mention that when Reynolds was traveling from California just prior to the Civil War back to the East Coast, and he was being assigned to West Point as a commander of the cadets at West Point, on the ship that he sailed on from California all the way around, he had to go around South America at that time, he met a girl. Her name is Catherine Hewitt. And we have a book in the bookstore, and maybe there's only limited quantity of the books left down there, but it's about the romance between John Fulton Reynolds and Kate Hewitt. And the guy who wrote this book, one of our battlefield guides, has found new information about Kate Hewitt and who she was, and a little bit of background on her, and it's just an excellent book to read. So we have it down there, brand new, or at least within the year. Years ago, Dale Gowan did a painting of Reynolds and Kate Hewitt. On the trip, and it's a several-week voyage, he met this girl, and they became secretly engaged. And this painting done by Dale Gowan is called The Promise. And basically, through correspondence, they come up with this agreement that after the war started, when the war ends, they'll be married. Now, like most people, I think they believed the war would only last a few months. They had no idea it would stretch on so long. And the agreement was that when the war was over, they get married. And if General Reynolds happened to be killed in battle, then Kate Hewitt, who was Catholic, would follow her faith and become a nun. And but John Fulton Reynolds' family is not Catholic; they're Protestant, and he kept his engagement to Kate Hewitt a secret from his family. And that's the the book has to do a lot with that, but we'll talk about that at the end. So early in the war, Reynolds rose up through the ranks and eventually was named commander of the 1st Army Corps. You might know, and a lot of people, read this in books here and there, on June 2nd, he was called to Washington, D.C. And we have a number of accounts that allude to the date, so we know it's a pretty good, solid date. And we got some basic ideas about what was discussed at that meeting. But Abraham Lincoln, was thinking about relieving Hooker of duty, but he wanted to have somebody to name as commander. So he asked Reynolds what he thought about it, and asked Reynolds if he would like to take command of the Army. And Reynolds talked to Lincoln for a little while and declined. According to one of his staff officers and Reynolds' sister later, he declined because he believed that Washington meddled too much in Army affairs, and that he would only take the job if he was given a free hand and not controlled. And really, I think they're upset with Henry Halleck and his just interfering with the plans of General Hooker and others. So anyway, he doesn't accept the job. But apparently he does tell him that probably General Meade is a better pick for this job anyway. So on June 28th, when Hooker resigns, command of the Army is given to General George Gordon Meade. And by all accounts, Reynolds rides to Meade's headquarters, discusses the situation with Meade, and really Meade will lean on Reynolds as his right-hand man in the days prior to the Battle of Gettysburg. And there's every reason to believe that these men are very good friends and really appreciate each other. And the one thing I think is important here is that when General Meade takes command, he's got people who are helping him and working with him instead of working behind his back to try to get him fired, which happened so much in the Civil War that the commander's subordinates were working against the commander of the Army. So I think it's just a perfect position, and Meade will heavily rely on John Fulton Reynolds in his advice during the campaign. Other people have presented it differently. Like in one of the books that I'm sure you all know I hate, Alan Gelso's book on the Gettysburg invasion, he claims that they're enemies and Reynolds forces, that cowardly Meade to fight at Gettysburg. Of course, it's just a big pile of anti-Meade propaganda, that book. But I really think that these two guys, appreciate each other and worked well together in the days prior to the campaign. And Reynolds is given command of a good chunk of the Army, a third of the Army at least. And as he's moving forward, it is General Reynolds with the 1st and 11th and the 3rd Corps that are to the western side of the advance of the Union Army, which advanced on like a 30-mile front from southern Maryland into southern Pennsylvania. And their flank is against the mountain passes as they move. Of course, Robert E. Lee's army is on the other side of those mountain passes. On June 30th, Reynolds makes his makes his headquarters at the Mertz Tavern on the Emmitsburg Road, about 5 miles south of Gettysburg. And here on the map, let's see, there's where I have the Mertz Tavern. This is the 1872 atlas. And I don't know if you can tell, the 3 divisions of the 1st Army Corps, red, white, and blue, I made them colorful, for the different divisions. So I put the 1st Division on I have them camped in the fields on either side of the creek, Marsh Creek, on the Emmitsburg Road. That little purple dot is, I had that in here for different program for another reason, but that's basically where Boyd's Bear is. And then he's got his 2nd Division camped just as they cross the Maryland line, not far from Emmitsburg. And then the 3rd Division, under, of course, Abner Doubleday, is along Bullfrog Road, Pumping Station Road intersection, and they're more in a line of battle. On the morning of June 30th, 1863, the Northern Army had marched a good distance to get into the position they were. And on June 30th, General Reynolds ordered his men to march early in the morning about 5 miles. And then they rested that afternoon at Marsh Creek. Now, I mention this because another thing that annoys me is this idea that it's a race to get to Gettysburg. And I guess the movie Gettysburg really promotes this idea that Buford is there at Gettysburg and he's hoping that General Reynolds can make it there in time, and they're going to hold out as long as they can. And the fact is that Reynolds could have easily marched from Emmitsburg to Gettysburg on June 30th, but he didn't, because that was not the plan, because they did not know the Southern Army are concentrating on the town of Gettysburg. They just marched to Marsh Creek. June 30th also happened to be the day the bi-monthly reports, the muster rolls had to be done, and all the soldiers were paid on June 30th. Not that they actually received any money, but that's when they fill out the muster rolls every 60 days, and it just happened to be on June 30th. And that's one reason why we have exact totals for the regimental strengths of the Union and Confederate Army at Gettysburg, because of the June 30th muster rolls. And that's why we have all the names of all the Pennsylvanians on the Pennsylvania Monument that were present for duty on June 30th, because coincidentally, the day before the battle happened to be the day when they put present for duty on the list of all the companies and regiments. So a lot of things were happening on June 30th. But Reynolds arrived at the Mertz Tavern and he collected information. And early that morning, General Buford stopped and visited him at the Mertz Tavern. This is something you don't hear much about, because when historians are writing about the battle, we go to the official reports and we read the correspondence back and forth, the messages sent between the generals. When generals meet face to face, there's no record, and we don't know what they were talking about. So we don't usually talk or mention it. But clearly, Buford had been in Fountaindale and rode to Fairfield, and at Fairfield, Pennsylvania, had a skirmish with some Mississippians of Davis's brigade, and then turned around, went back to Fountaindale and Monterey, and then marched to Emmitsburg, and then marched up the Emmitsburg Road to Gettysburg. And this all happened early in the morning. So at some point, Buford stops and talks to Reynolds. In a dispatch to General Pleasonton on the morning of June 30th, Buford mentioned, "I have seen General Reynolds and posted him." So Buford and Reynolds talk on the morning of June 30th. And what's really interesting is Buford tells Reynolds that there's a huge force of Confederate soldiers in Fairfield. And when Reynolds goes into position on June 30th, he has Abner Doubleday's division out along Bullfrog Road in a line of battle. And this road, of course, leads to Fairfield. Fairfield's right there. So this road leads right over to Fairfield. So he's concerned that the Southern Army might be in force in Fairfield, and they might attack him on the evening of June 30th or the afternoon of June 30th. And so Doubleday's division is at the ready. And even on the Emmitsburg Road towards Gettysburg, he has a skirmish line out across here, just in case. And this idea that the Southern Army's in Fairfield is with him on July 1st when he's killed in battle. Because one of his last messages to Abner Doubleday was, "Watch out for the Fairfield Road." And he believes that the Southern Army is going to appear in force on the Fairfield Road because they're known to be in Fairfield. In reality, just a small portion of Davis's brigade was sent to Fairfield, and on the morning of June 30th, they returned to their camp at Cashtown and ended up coming to Gettysburg with the rest of the troops. I know, I'm getting too technical here. This is just in case you want to know this kind of stuff. But my point is that we have some good accounts of the Mertz Tavern. So, let's see. The road from Emmitsburg to Gettysburg was laid out shortly after the establishment of Adams County in 1800. John Nicholas Mertz, spelled M-O-R-I-T-Z, like Moritz, but locally pronounced Mertz. You don't argue with people about how to pronounce something. It's believed that he ran a tavern here since 1812. For many years, the tavern enjoyed a flourishing business with the stagecoach traffic that ran from like Hagerstown over to Frederick and, up through Gettysburg. And John Nicholas Mertz was a large landowner in the area. Following the outbreak of the Civil War, his son John joined Company C of the Potomac Home Brigade Cavalry, recruited in nearby Emmitsburg. He was actually captured in the war and would die as a Southern prisoner. George Washington Shriver, of course now the Historical Society owns the Shriver House in Gettysburg, he also was in that same company, the Potomac Home Brigade. John Nicholas Mertz himself died in March of 1863 at the age of 79. So at the time of the battle, the tavern was operated by his son, Samuel Mertz. In 1888, it was a post office established there. It was called Fair Play. So sometimes on the maps you see it as Fair Play. It was, in some references, according to William Stork, it's called the Red Tavern, although it appears to be painted white here. This is my first knowledge of the tavern. This is from John Schilt, Roads to Gettysburg, which I got when I was a kid because you talked about where the troops marched, and I lived down in northern Maryland and really wanted to know about the troops marching through my area. So I don't know when he took this photograph. It probably is like 1950s, but it doesn't look anything like that now. Here, about 5 years ago at the Adams County Historical Society, I found this photograph unidentified in our collection. And we got a really nice copy of it, and I realized right away that it was the Fair Play Post Office. And so here it is in the 1890s as the post office at Fair Play. And of course, you might know that this building still stands. Check out where the pump is here and the balcony on the side of the building. I met the lady who lived there last year. And, for the society, I actually did a bus trip. When was that? I had the bus down here in front of the parking lot for one of our trips at some point. But you might not realize it's there, but go down the Emmitsburg Road. And just before you hit Route 15, do you know there's a big fireworks place? They got a giant flag. Just before you get there on the left is this building. It's still there. And so that's where Reynolds spent the night before he died. So for homework, you have to go down and see that. She is a nice lady. I don't know what her reaction will be if you knock on her door and say, Tim told me to come here and you'd give me a tour, but boy, was she really nice. Okay. But look at the well right where the pump was. Isn't that awesome? So again, let's see, at the hotel, Let's see, we have several accounts of it. General Howard met there in person with Reynolds, and they went over dispatches on June 30th and studied the area maps and discussed the option for the morning march. And you probably know, at the same time all this is taking place, and General Reynolds is in the advance of the army, and he's trying to figure out where the Southerners are, and he's gathering information, and General Buford is ridden to Gettysburg. General Meade is preparing the Pipe Creek Defense Plan. And according to that plan, General Reynolds is supposed to march to Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st. And then if he encounters the enemy, all the units will fall back to a predetermined defensive position. But it appears as the day goes on, Reynolds becomes intrigued by the idea of moving the army to Gettysburg. And he is given some latitude. He sends some aides to General Meade's headquarters, and one of them I'll mention here in a second, William Riddle, gets back early on the morning of July 1st, and it appears as if Meade has given him a little more latitude. Go to Gettysburg, see what the situation. Of course, I think a lot of people would point out that when Meade issues the Pipe Creek Circular on the morning of July 1st, it causes confusion because everyone thinks that even if there's a battle out in front of them, that they're just all going to fall back to the predetermined defensive position. And that causes Slocum a lot of issues at Two Taverns because, he could have been here on July 1st and wasn't. But according to William Riddle, there's lots of stuff in the official reports sent back and forth between the different commanders on June 30th. But according to the account of William Riddle, a member of Reynolds' staff, at 10 p.m. on that day, June 30th, the general sent me with dispatches to General Meade, who is at Taneytown, 13 miles from the tavern. And there, I received the order for the advance on Gettysburg in an early hour on the 1st July. On my return to the tavern at 4 a.m., I found General Reynolds enjoying a sound sleep. I guess the first he had had for several nights, and not in a bed, mind you, but laying upon the floor of the room wrapped in a blanket in accordance with his disregard for luxury, for which he was remarkable. I read the dispatches for him to see if there were any sufficient important to require his being awakened. And on finding them orders to move, I woke him and read to them 3 times while he rested his head upon his hands. And this is actually from a letter written on August 4th, 1863 in the collections of Franklin and Marshall. Okay. But on the morning of July 1st, they're going to start their move. Now, an interesting thing happened. Throughout June 30th, word spread around southern Adams County that a large force of Union soldiers was camped in the vicinity of Marsh Creek on the Emmitsburg Road. And farmers loaded wagons with food and things that they were making, and they drove to the army camp and fed them. We have a bunch of accounts of that. The massive numbers in the soldiers in the area also attracted young boys. 16-year-old Jacob Cornelius Shriver was one of those hanging around at Mertz Tavern discussing the situation with the soldiers. His brother, a week earlier, had joined Robert Bell's Adams County Cavalry, and on the Friday before the battle, he was part of those men that faced off against Juba Early as they marched across to Adams County. At some point, Reynolds noticed the boy, and I'm assuming maybe he was rather plump, because Reynolds gave him a note to take home to his mother. According to the history of the Shriver family, attached to the pass was a request for provisions for the general's breakfast and that of his staff. The lad delivered the pass to his parents, and early the next morning, they took meat, potatoes, eggs, and bread to where General Reynolds and his men were encamped, which was near the Emmitsburg Road. Mrs. Alice Shriver helped to prepare the breakfast for the general and his staff. All of them ate heartily. General Reynolds offered her $5 for the provisions and her work, but she declined to accept. as a little food did not mean much to a farmer. General Reynolds appreciated her good heart and therefore insisted that she take the money. He said, of course, this is written much later, "Take it, for I may not live to come back this way and reimburse you for your kindness." Word then came that the rebels were coming. There was a great stir in the camp. The tents were taken down at once, and the soldiers marched to Gettysburg. So there you go. Miss Alice Shriver gave Reynolds his last meal. I'm going to get some stuff out here. Okay, I should have prepared better. Okay, there. Okay. So Reynolds and his staff ride to Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st. Now, I'd like to mention that Reynolds, again, is in charge of the wing. So Reynolds and his staff ride to Gettysburg. Abner Doubleday is in charge of the 1st Army Corps. So he gets Wadsworth's division on the road and starts them in the march, and then goes back to organize Romus's division, who's down near the Maryland line, put them on the road. And then he also sends his division, the 3rd Division, by the Millerstown Road to Gettysburg. So they actually march a slightly different route. So he's busy doing all that while Reynolds rides to Gettysburg. When Reynolds gets close to Gettysburg, he gets a message from General Buford. And of course, this message is a result of the first shot of the battle. So early in the morning, Marcellus Jones sees a cloud of dust coming down the road, fires a shot at them, and then sends a message to her tavern, where the major of the 8th Illinois will then send a message to the Eagle Hotel to General Buford and tell him that the Southerners are approaching on Route 30 in force. And then he sends a message to Reynolds, who's on his way up the Emmitsburg Road. And when Reynolds gets the message, he spurs towards Gettysburg. According to Charles Vail, who's on Reynolds' staff, when we got within a half a mile of the town, we met a citizen on horseback who appeared to be much frightened. The general stopped him and inquired what the trouble was. The man stated that our cavalry was fighting. The general rode on. We stopped at Mr. George's house to inquire the way. You might know the George house is at the intersection of the Emmitsburg Road, a short distance from Washington Street. The general, when we got into town, we saw there was considerable excitement. So the general rode to the front at once and found General Buford engaged on a ridge in front of the seminary. Okay. So, let's see. Oh, when he gets to town, one thing I don't think people think about? Buford's headquarters is not at the Lutheran Theological Seminary. In the movie Gettysburg, they show General Buford at the seminary. I was there the day they filmed that. And, the Historical Society was in that building at the time. And they show Buford writing a note to Reynolds while he's sitting on a cot in front of the seminary building. But no, General Buford's headquarters were not in a field in front of the cemetery. They were in the nicest hotel in Gettysburg, the Eagle Hotel. And specifically, he did all his business from the bar in the Eagle Hotel because he didn't want any of his men to be in the bar. The first thing he did when he got to town is issue an order that no soldiers are allowed to drink and no civilians will give alcohol or sell alcohol to soldiers, and had it posted all around the town. So he's at the tavern, the Eagle Hotel. So when Reynolds comes riding into town, he goes to the Eagle Hotel. And when he gets to the Eagle Hotel, Buford's not there, because Buford rode out to the Lutheran Seminary. He has a signal officer, Aaron B. Jerome, in the cupola, and he went into the cupola. So that's when he first goes into the seminary. But there's a book from the 1890s, Stein's Army of the Potomac, and we have it over here next door. And according to this book, this guy came to Gettysburg and interviewed people. Entering Gettysburg, he rode to the Eagle Hotel, where he met Peter Culp, a citizen of that place who was acting as a scout for our army. After questioning him about the situation, he directed him, Culp, to take him to the Lutheran seminary where Buford was in the belfry watching the battle. And here's Peter Culp. This is the best I have of him from our collection. It's a Xerox. But he's the citizen who said, hey, I know where Buford is. And he took him to the Eagle Hotel. To the Lutheran Seminary. Robert McLean, a kid of town, is also standing out there when Reynolds rides up. And he lives on Baltimore Street, the son of Moses McLean, and he gives a really nice account. The next morning, meaning July 1st, I was at the Eagle Hotel corner in a group of bystanders when General Reynolds and his staff rode up and, that wasn't good. Okay. And inquired for Buford, who had quarters there. And were told in my hearing that he had gone to the front, whence even then from the west along the Chambersburg Pike the sounds of cannonading were proceeding. I then walked on foot to Chambersburg Street where the roads forked, where a number of people had gathered in order to hear more distinctly. And while standing there, after a little time, General Reynolds and his staff returned from the seminary, where I have since learned he conferred with Buford, and he asked for the nearest way to the Taneytown Road. He must mean Emmitsburg Road. He wore a cap. The statue in the National Cemetery is a very fair representation of him as he appeared that morning. His restless dark eyes are pictured still on my mind's retina. In an hour or two's time, he had fallen by the shot of a sharpshooter at the front. And so there we got a good account. And of course, we have an account of Reynolds on July 1st from Daniel Skelly. You probably know that Daniel Skelly on the morning of July 1st went out to Seminary Ridge and was watching Buford's men, and he heard the skirmish start miles away, and then slowly it got closer and closer. And then an artillery shell from the Southern Army flew over his head and exploded. And then he and dozens of men and boys turned and ran towards the town. And he describes running with artillery shells exploding nearby. And as he comes to the Chambersburg Pike, somewhere around like Pizza Hut, I'm going to guess, when I reached the pike, there galloped past me a general and his staff who, upon reaching the top of the ridge, turned left into the lane towards the seminary buildings. This I have always believed was General Reynolds coming onto the field and going to the seminary where he had an interview with General Buford, then on the cupola of the seminary, before going out where the battle was then in progress. The time was about 9 o'clock or near it. Again, you probably realize in 1863, people aren't really paying attention to what time it is, and no one has the same, they don't synchronize their watches like they do in modern military movies. So timing is really tough for what time it is. So, let's see, Aaron B. Jerome's account. I thought I had that right here. Oh, I must have it on the next page. Okay, so you probably know that Reynolds rides up to the seminary. You know, I don't know exactly how they rode. I always imagine that they turn somewhere and come riding up to the south side of the seminary, like they do in the movie Gettysburg. But there's the cattle guard they have there is kind of odd, and it's not really made for horses. And it seems like they might have to go to the top of the ridge and over. But anyway, in some manner, General Reynolds approaches the cupola. And according to Aaron B. Jerome, who is the signal officer in the cupola, in a letter written in like 1865, General Reynolds and his staff came up on a gallop in advance of their corps when the following communication was made Reynolds himself, will be here in 5 minutes. His corps is about a mile behind. Buford, I'm sorry, let me just skip ahead here. When Reynolds came up, seeing Buford in the cupola, he cried out, "What's the matter, John?" "The devil's to pay," said he, Buford. And going down the ladder, General Reynolds remarked that he hoped Buford could hold out until his corps came up. With characteristic brevity, Buford said, "I reckon I can." Reynolds then said, "Let's ride out and see all about it." And mounting, we rode out. So Jerome went with them. Two things about this. Well, I could give you three things about it. First of all, they mention a ladder specifically. And of course, now there's steps that go to the cupola. So I was wondering if in the attic, that would be a really tall 20-foot ladder, because that's a pretty good distance from the attic to the top of the cupola where you get out. And then two, Rosengarten, Joseph Rosengarten, who's another staff officer with Reynolds, says that when Buford yells down, he yells down, "There'll be hell to pay." So honestly, and that was written in 1884. This is like 1865. So we don't really know if the devil's to pay or hell's to pay. And then the third thing is, it's clear from the existing accounts that Buford comes down, they get on horses and ride out. Reynolds does not climb in the cupola. Now, what muddies the waters is in 1913, Henry Eyster Jacobs, who's a graduate of the Lutheran Seminary, gives a speech at the 50th anniversary of the battle, and he says Reynolds was in the cupola. So, and that's where you get that from sometimes, if you've heard that. But we don't think Reynolds isn't, I don't think Reynolds is in the cupola. So then Buford and his staff and Reynolds and his staff, can you imagine when you think about these generals riding from place to place? I don't want you to think of like two guys riding. They each have like 5 or 10 people with them. So when Meade and his staff goes out to see Sickles at the peach orchard, each one of his staff officers has a staff. So we're talking about a group of like 30 people riding out together, not just like 2. Okay, so both of these men and their staffs ride out, and they ride out to Caliph's Battery, and they ride out to the McPherson Barn, where the Reynolds equestrian statue is. And they talk about the situation. And Reynolds basically says, okay, hold out as long as you can. I'll go back. I'll get the First Army Corps. We'll bring them up. We'll hold out right here. And Reynolds makes the decision to fight the battle in the fields west of the town. At this very moment, he then grabs one of his aides, Stephen Weld, and he tells him to ride to Tawnytown, Maryland, and tell Meade he's decided to bring the whole army to Gettysburg. So he's going to order for the concentration of the whole army. And of course, this will set in motion the army marching to Gettysburg. And again, this is part of probably the verbal latitude that Meade gave Riddle to give to Reynolds early in the morning on July 1st. But again, we fight about these things because the evidence, we don't have Reynolds' account of what happened. Okay. So then they ride out. And Reynolds also sends a messenger back to Wadsworth Division coming up the Tawnytown Road to just double quick. Okay. And then Reynolds rides back to town. And, here's that famous view from Seminary Ridge looking towards the edge of the town. He decides that they're not going to bring the First Corps through the town of Gettysburg. The people are going to bring wine and beer and flowers, and they're going to sing, and they're going to slow the army down. So he's going to have them leave the Emmitsburg Road near the Kadori farm and cut across the fields. And he has his staff officers break down fences on their way. Now, here is a version of this view from the Adams County Historical Society, and here's a blow-up of the buildings at the edge of the town. I want you to pay close attention to this building. This is the building that would later be owned by Basil Biggs, but it's Catherine Foster's house on West Middle Street at the time of the battle. There's that step-down house. Today, it was just sold recently, but if you know where that is. Behind it is, this is the Gettysburg Female Institute, the academy with a cupola on it, owned by the English family. Catherine Foster says, when the skirmishing commenced, we went up to the western balcony of our house to watch the maneuvering at 10 p.m. or 10 a.m. Look, the western balcony, they're standing right there. The artillery began to play, and the First Corps came up. General Reynolds dashed through the streets and called for us to go to our cellar. The infantry were marching double quick, some of them on the street and others directly in line west through the fields to the west of the seminary, whilst cavalry messengers flew over fences and fields like a shower of meteors. And Michael Jacobs, who also lives on Middle Street, said, soon after the battle had begun, the residents on the western edge of town were advised by General Reynolds to leave their residences, that the shot and shell of the enemy might reach them or injure them, and to retire to positions north and east of the borough. So we have a few accounts, other accounts also, that suggest Reynolds and his staff are telling these people to get out of here. And, he's got his staff riding up and down. Now, interestingly, we have two things. John Burns, in one of his accounts, claims that he sees Reynolds, and Reynolds is confused about how he's going to bring the troops. And John Burns suggests to him, let's bring them across the field south and west of the town. And so John Burns takes an active role with a hatchet, chopping up fences and leading the troops into battle. We don't have any reason to believe that, but he says it. Also, J. Howard Wirt claims that he's the one. And I don't know if you ever read J. Howard Wirt. He claims a lot of stuff. But he claims he's the one who tells Reynolds to bring the troops across the fields south and west of the town and assists in that work. We do know that Reynolds has Wadsworth's division leave the Emmitsburg Road near the Cadore Farm. This is Dale Gowland's painting of that event, and they are to cut across the fields here. That's Wadsworth. You like Wadsworth? He's always shown in these views, General Wadsworth. And then, after Reynolds is on the Emmitsburg Road and talks to the advance of the First Army Corps, he rides back out across the fields, and he rides out to the McPherson barn, and he stands there and he watches. And that's when the Southern Army is lining up in Archer's brigade and Davis's brigade on Seminary Ridge, and are starting their advance down towards Willoughby's Run. And as Cutler's brigade, Lysander Cutler, the first of the Union troops to arrive on the field, comes in, he orders them into position on the Chambersburg Pike and brings up James Hall's battery and places them where Caliph's battery had been. See the McPherson barn there? And this event occurs right where the Reynolds equestrian statue is located. So 2 times Reynolds is at the spot where his equestrian statue is today. And I point that out because a lot of people don't realize that. They don't realize that he was out there. And, something really happens bad for Hall's battery here. Within Wadsworth's hearing, Wadsworth being there, Reynolds tells Captain Hall to unlimber his guns and do not retreat from this position at all, unless you hear from me. Of course, he rides away and gets killed. And Wadsworth, I guess, takes this as a personal affront. So when the line falls apart and Cutler's brigade is falling back, he doesn't send word to Hall's battery to retreat. And they get sort of overrun out there. Now, after Reynolds does that, when you stand on Seminary Ridge, the woodlot on the Samuel or the John Jacob Herbst farm, I like to call him John Jacob Jingleheimer Herbst, the woodlot blocks the Fairfield Road. And Reynolds is really concerned about the Fairfield Road. He sends a message to Abner Doubleday, who is bringing up the troops, the rest of the troops. And Doubleday rode forward onto the field and was near the Fairfield Road. And he tells Doubleday, hey, you take care of the Fairfield Road, and I'll take care of the Chambersburg Pike. And then he sees the Iron Brigade arriving under Solomon Meredith. I just love this from like a postcard that was done on the 150th anniversary. I also like the fact that I know some of these guys in it. Used to see them all the time. But he sees them coming across the fields, and so then Reynolds sends a message over to the 2nd Wisconsin to immediately march. You get out of their column into line and make a charge. And he rides out to meet them, and Reynolds will lead the 2nd Wisconsin in a charge because Archer's brigade is heading across Willoughby's Run and coming up through the Herbst woodlot. And again, Reynolds doesn't know that there's not just a ton of Confederates marching up the Fairfield Road at that moment, but he figures Doubleday can bring up the other divisions and try to hold the Confederates back on that road. He needs to deal with the current situation. And of course, here is, one of the things that the leadership tours are all over when you come to Gettysburg. So Reynolds has sent a messenger to Tawnytown, Maryland, to bring up the rest of the army. No one else knows he's done that. He hasn't had a personal discussion with Wadsworth about the situation or Doubleday. Hasn't had time. And they don't know what Reynolds' plan is. Probably since Reynolds is in command of the wing, he should be riding back behind the seminary building now and making plans for the arrival of the troops. But no. He sees Archer's brigade coming, and he leads the 2nd Wisconsin in a charge. And he's killed. And all the plans he may have had are gone. And all we have now is what Doubleday might think that Reynolds was planning to do. And in the leadership tours, and you see them out here all the time, they will bring this up. Reynolds is micromanaging. You must delegate authority to your people, and you must take care of the bigger picture items if you're in charge. They just, you hear about they're doing it all the time. So I think this is one of the things where, everyone can have their own opinion about why he did it. He felt like that he was best, he was needed at that moment to inspire the men and lead them into a charge against Archer's brigade because it appeared they might break through. Okay. So now, one thing that bothers me, again, I think it's my favorite thing to tell you what bothers me. That on maps that people draw of the battle, they have the Iron Brigade marching straight north along Seminary Ridge. And then they all come out of their line or column into line and make it 90-degree perpendicular line and then charge straight across. It doesn't make any sense. And like on this map, for instance, look, they got the 24th Michigan all the way down south of the Herbst farm charging, across Willoughby's Run at that spot. That cannot be how it happened. It's too nice and neat. And here is a map that's drawn by John Batchelder. It's in the Library of Congress. It's from 1878. And forgive me if Wayne Motz watches this, because we are filming it, that I forget if he or I found it. He definitely made a copy of it. But we used to go to the archives all the time together. And on this map, he shows the Iron Brigade coming into position, and you can see it's more disorganized than on a nice, neat map. But the 2nd Wisconsin comes first in line. And oh, by the way, the 2nd Wisconsin makes their charge without loading their muskets. So they suffer heavy casualties going into Archer's brigade without loaded muskets. And, of course, Reynolds is killed. But this is a really cool map. And he's got a little diagram on the bottom. Charge ordered by General Reynolds at about 9:30 a.m., just before he was shot by one of Archer's skirmishers at the point marked. And look, he's got this little thing, Reynolds skirmishers. Look. So I want to bring your attention to that. We're going to talk about this in a few minutes here, but look where he has them shot. This would be right where Reynolds Avenue meets Meredith Avenue, right there. Good. Now, according to Captain Wilcox, who was interviewed in Philadelphia and in Baltimore, and his account is spread across the newspapers right after the battle. And Captain Wilcox is another of his aides. Major General Reynolds was placing his men when he was fatally wounded and urging them on to support General Buford. He cried out his enthusiasm, "For God's sakes, forward, my brave boys, forward!" And forward they did go. Just then, General Reynolds received his fatal wound, and falling over upon Captain Wilcox, his aide, who was riding beside him, he exclaimed, "Good God, Wilcox, I am killed." So that's the only time you really see that quote, when Wilcox is being quoted. Let's see, I got paper here. Okay. Then, of course, we have Charles Vale's account, who's an aide. The general... I didn't read that. That's a different thing. Okay. The general rode along in rear of our lines, the woods on our left, called, I believe, McPherson's, though I heard while I was in Gettysburg they belonged to Mr. Herbst, which is true. As he rode along, he saw the enemy advancing through the woods facing the Cashtown Road. The general saw at a glance that something desperately must be done or our troops would be entirely flanked, as there was a regiment coming down from the seminary, but a short distance from the woods, the 19th Indiana, belonging to the brigade on the left of the Cashtown Road. He ordered it forward into line at the double quick and ordered them to charge into the woods, leading the charge in person. The regiment charged through the woods nobly, but the enemy were too strong, and they gave way to the right. The enemy, still pushing on, were now not much more than 60 paces from where the general was. Minnie balls were flying thick. The general looked towards the seminary, I suppose to see if other troops were coming on. And as he did so, a Minnie ball struck him in the back of the neck, and he fell from his horse dead. So we have here's the other part of Vale's account I should read. Okay. He never spoke a word or moved a muscle after he was struck. I have seen many men killed in action, but never saw a ball do its work so instantly as did the ball which struck General Reynolds. Charles Vale wrote that letter in 1864 to David McConaughey, who was the president of the newly formed Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. Fascinating, fascinating. Okay, I don't need that one. Let's see. Okay, so this was a map that I made when we were working on a seminar for the first day's battle. And again, I always try to make it so that the troops are coming in more on an angle, although I have to admit the regiments are a little small here. The 24th Michigan, basically on the bottom, they cross Willoughby's Run unopposed and then swing their line to the north and march up north and outflank Archer's brigade, and they'll really do a lot of damage as the rest of the Iron Brigade is heading in. The 2nd Wisconsin went in first with unloaded guns and lost heavily during that part of the engagement. I think they lost 116 men killed, wounded, or captured in the morning action of the first day. So, and of course, the Iron Brigade drives Archer's brigade back and captures General Archer. I read that. So let's just show you some illustrations of Reynolds. This is Keith Rocco, I think. And if I get, since they might watch, if I get the artist wrong, feel free to crucify me in the comments. It's fine. So this is Keith Rocco, and he's got the 2nd Wisconsin coming up the slight slope before you get over and then across Reynolds Avenue into the woods. They were owned by John Herbst. They were referred to in the battle as McPherson's Woods, and today they're called Reynolds Woods, okay? But they're heading in. And here is Mark Maritato. Is that how you pronounce it? And I don't have a very good version of that, but there's his Reynolds leading the 2nd Wisconsin. Here's Matthew Brady's image that was recorded like on June 15th from Seminary Ridge. And, the guy who's probably an assistant of Matthew Brady, there's Matthew Brady, is pointing out near the spot where Reynolds fell. And you can see the Lutheran Theological Seminary. And just because Gary likes me to do it, here's Gary's colorized image of this, if that brings it more to life for you. Look at, you might not have noticed the Charles Philip Croft House on the seminary campus. But isn't that great, the cupola? And look how open the woods are. And this also I stole from Gary Edelman. This is his extreme blow-up of the edge of the Herbst woodlot. In the book, The Iron Brigade, by, what's his name? I'm sure you guys know. Alan Nolan, thank you. Alan Nolan. I gave a tour one time. Alan Nolan and I gave a tour of the Iron Brigade at Gettysburg just before he died. But Alan Nolan's book, he said that the Gettysburg townspeople used to have picnics in Reynolds Grove, and that's why they were so open. And I have never found a source for that. I tend to think they had cows grazing in the woods, and they beat down the underbrush. But there was a fence along the edge of the woods that you can see is pretty badly tore up in this image. Here is Briscoe. I think he did illustrations in the 1880s or 90s. And here's his Reynolds death scene. Here's Xanthus Smith from Philadelphia. You can see Reynolds there in this scene. You can see some of the people don't have any knowledge of what the area really looks like. Here is, out of Columbia, Pennsylvania. Schmel, good. I'm glad we got you guys here. Bradley Schmel, good. Bradley Schmel, who, by the way, his illustration of Devil's Den is on the front of our Devil's Den book, so I should know Brad pretty well. And here is Don Triani's, Reynolds leading the 2nd Wisconsin into battle. Apparently, the 2nd Wisconsin had charged by him, and he was standing behind the regiment when Archer's brigade fired a volley out of the woods and fired kind of high, I guess, and hit him. Here's the National Tribune's Death of Reynolds, a veterans magazine I think this is from like the 1890s. And then we have this, I just got this one off the internet because I just liked it. It was it's a modern artist, and it was at an auction, at Heritage Auction. I hope it didn't bring that much money. And then the Marvel Comics Death of Reynolds, which might be a little bit better than that last one we just saw. I don't know. I shouldn't pick on people. And here's a couple drawings by Alfred Woad, I believe, of the Death of Reynolds. Actually, this one on the left is someone else. I forget. But and then here is the Alfred Woad engraving of a sketch he made showing the death of Reynolds. And here is the actual sketch at the Library of Congress. And I did not know this until recently when they put it up. But on the back, there's a map. And it shows the scene of the action, and it shows the woodlot, and it shows the regiments, the 2nd Wisconsin, and that'll be the 7th and the 19th and the 24th going in. Tidball's battery. Do you know Tidball was the commander of the brigade that Caliph's battery was in for a time? And here's good. You see this? Fairchild's regiment. Colonel Fairchild is the 2nd Wisconsin. And look, Reynolds fell. And this is a line of missile which killed Reynolds. Look at that. Love that. Slate Ridge. So, and Alfred Wood is somebody who's known to have been here on the battlefield. And of course, we have some depictions of Reynolds' death from the movie. So, 2 stories about this. One, I was here when they filmed the movie. And I remember distinctly talking to the reenactors of the 14th Brooklyn, these guys. And I was speaking to them in the bar, the Farnsworth House. I live at the Farnsworth House. It's all right if I'm in the bar. I was talking to them, and they told me that day that one of their leaders went up to Ron Maxwell and said, "Hey, did you know that when Reynolds was killed, the 14th Brooklyn actually all gathered around him?" No way. They're in a totally different place. This absolutely not true. I was horrified by this. And of course, when Reynolds is killed, they have this, I don't know. I think I heard Ron Maxwell in an interview say it was based on the painting of The Death of Wolfe at Quebec. You ever see that, where all the officers are gathered around? And so John Rothman is the actor that played John Fulton Reynolds in the movie. And do you know that during the 30th anniversary celebration of the movie, he came and visited us, and I, with some other colleagues, mostly me, had figured out where this scene was filmed today in relation to, because there's modern houses built around it. And so we took John Rothman out to the spot where he was killed. And in my defense, I didn't know that we were all not looking to the camera, Gary crucifies me mercilessly for not realizing that we were trying to portray that scene. But they all portrayed it there. Love it. And here's Frederick Rothermel at the State Museum in Harrisburg. This is his death of Reynolds, and you see him being carried off on a stretcher. And William Storick, who wrote about it in the 1930s, the superintendent of battlefield guides, said it was members of the 7th Wisconsin that carried his body off. And I didn't know that. I didn't realize that. Now, I should tell you that we have a couple accounts. I don't see it in here. We have a couple accounts of other people who say they were with Reynolds when he was killed. We have this obituary of Alexander Walker, who is with Cole's Cavalry, the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade Cavalry. And he says that at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, he was assigned to messenger duty and was one of those who saw Reynolds as he fell mortally wounded. And that's always been fascinating to me, because we also have an account by Daniel Skelly. Daniel Skelly is with General Howard on the roof of the Fahnestock building. Let's see. As they were on the roof, General Howard, a scout called to him that General Reynolds had been killed and he should come out to the field immediately. The scout was George Gwynn, a member of Cole's Maryland Cavalry, and from our county, just a few miles from town. And then we also have an account by George Weichert, who was with Cole's Maryland Cavalry, Company C, 1st Potomac Home Brigade Cavalry, but had been discharged and was living in his house near Devil's Den at the time of the battle. He must have joined his unit. And on his business card, he says, on the first day of the battle, I piloted General Reynolds to the field and saw him fall from his horse. And it seems that on June 28th, there was a group of the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade that was at the Battle of Fountaindale, a skirmish between Confederate artillery who were gathering horses and this unit from Frederick. And then they rode to Emmitsburg and ran into Reynolds advancing. And I'm suspecting that this dozen men or so must have stayed with Reynolds and acted as scouts and guides. We have 3 of them who claim that they had some part in Reynolds' death on July 1st. So where was Reynolds killed? Okay, this is the complicated part of my program. So you can see this is the Elliott burial map, and they show where Union and Southern soldiers are buried around the Herbst woodlot. The northern boundary of the woodlot being the boundary between the McPherson farm and the Herbst farm, in case you didn't know that. Now, also, of course, we have this drawing by John Batchelder in 1878. And Fries pointed this out to me one day. He's like, well, the Warren map says he was killed, I'm like, what are you talking about? The Warren map doesn't tell you where Reynolds was killed. He's like, yes, it does. And, I looked at it, I'm like, wow, I never saw that before. So there's an R on the Warren map made in 1868 showing near the spot where Reynolds was killed. At least that's how we interpret it. And then we have the John Batchelder isometrical map drawn in 1863. And there they show Reynolds, where Reynolds fell. I think we can all agree that he fell near the eastern edge of the woodlot. But exactly where is been contested over the years. Let's see. Do I have what am I showing next? Oh, first thing I wanted to show is John Batchelder is just remarkable in his attention to detail. This is the Warren map that was surveyed by a team of Army engineers in 1868 and in 1869. It was 2 summers that they were out surveying. And it shows here the Herbst woodlot, and it shows the New Springs Avenue with the horse-drawn trolley that has that bridge, across Willoughby's Run. But it also shows the fence along the northern edge of the property of Herbst and Herbst, between Herbst and McPherson. Now, it's on 2 different pages. That's why it looks like that. And then we also have that photograph that was taken that shows where that fence line is. But you see those trees over there? There's some bushes and some trees along that fence. And sure enough, there, you can see them a little clearer. There's some trees. Sure enough, on the John Batchelder isometrical map, he shows that fence, and he shows trees along it. But they're not shown on the Warren map. And here's a version of that shows that fence, so you can see they're not there. Well, in the 1870s, John Batchelder took the Warren map and he made changes. And I don't know if people realize this. So by the time you get to the 1876 map of the battlefield, which is the Warren map as a base with John Batchelder's changes, and I have to admit, it was Fraz, again, that clued me into this. All of a sudden, he puts those trees back. So the point being is that I give John Batchelder a lot of leeway when he says something about the battle, as being true. Some people aren't so gracious with John Batchelder as me. Okay, so cameramen were attracted by this site. So William Frassinito, in his book, Early Photography at Gettysburg, does an analysis of the photographs that were taken of the place where Reynolds was killed. And I love what he says at the very beginning of his chapter. The reader is forewarned that the following evaluation of that site involves some complex issues for which no definitive resolution currently exists. Wow. You wonder why he's writing about it then, right? Okay. So this is a photograph taken by Hanson Weaver, presumably in 1866, place where Reynolds was shot. And you can see on the side it says the tree near marked R. The tree's marked R. And let's see, go to that. Oh, wrong button. I hit the wrong button. Okay. Now, here is a version of it from an original that Fraz got from the family member. And look how clear the R is here in this version. So, and then a year later in 1867, the Tysons say that this is the tree marked with the R. And you can kind of see the R where Reynolds fell. And Fraz notes in his book that even the casual observer will notice this is not the same tree. I keep looking at it thinking that the stump, that this thing looks, this may be the same tree from a different angle. It's got the little tree behind it, I know. But it doesn't really matter because we're going to have more trees anyway. But so this is an 1867 image by the Tysons, C.J. Tyson, of the Reynolds tree. And this one appears in an 1871 book that we have in our library, a poetry book on the battle. And it's definitely the grave of a man, we don't know which one, of the 24th Michigan in front of the tree. In 1869, the Utica Zouaves camped in Reynolds Woods. And you can see there's the R on the tree, the spot where General Reynolds fell. And here's a mumper image, which appears to be the same tree as the Weaver view from 1866. This got to be in 1870s. So an early date might be 1872 for mumper, but a mumper stereo view of the tree. Now, if the Tyson tree is different, and that also had an R in it, you know, I just don't understand why they're two different trees. And you can see a little bit of the tree there. And then there's an 1878 Tipton view where clearly we're talking about a totally different tree, some 50 yards north of the site of the other tree. If you're asking me where I think Reynolds fell, I think he fell at the southeasterly corner of the Herbst woodlot. And this is at the northeasterly corner of the Herbst woodlot. And then we have an 1888 view of a different tree. So there are 4 or 5 different trees that Reynolds was killed at. And you can see here's a couple more views of that tree. This seems to be the tree that had the sign on it for the longest. And there's a picture of the sign. And can you see at the base of this tree, there's a little post? And it says GBMA number. It's one of those numbered stakes that were driven by John Batchelder, presumably for the site where Reynolds was killed. Of course, you can see it's obviously been pulled out of the ground and then leaned against that tree. So who knows where it was originally. We don't have a view of it somewhere else. And then we have this view of the tree. You can see where it is in relation to the Reynolds monument that was placed in 1886. And then what I really like about this one, you can see the monument, and then there's another sign on a tree up here. Did they have multiple signs on either side of it? If you're asking me, they put a sign on a tree, they cut the tree down, they sell it. They move the sign to another tree. They cut the tree down and sell it. That makes a lot of sense, knowing about Gettysburg commercialization. Okay. Well, Reynolds' body is taken, off the battlefield and then carried to the other side of town to the George house. According to Charles Vail, when we arrived at the seminary, I concluded to carry the body to the Emmitsburg Road and did so, carrying it to Mr. George's house, a small stone house. I'm sorry. Okay. As we were lying him down, I first found the wound in the back of his neck. I then saw the general was dead. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you that in crossing the fields between the woods where he was killed and the seminary, he gasped a little, and I thought he was coming to his senses. We stopped for a moment, and I gave him a drop of water, but he would not drink. It must have been his last struggle. So he says Reynolds came to for a moment. Also, we have this just incredible story about this house. Do you know the little stone house near the entrance to the hospital? A beautiful white silk shawl, more than 125 years old, worn by the mother and daughter at both their weddings and bearing slight marks of blood with which it stained when it was placed under the head of General Reynolds during the first day of the battle, is in possession of Mrs. Leo Bushman of Baltimore Street. So there's this shawl. And someone told me it's still out there. So if somebody's watching, we'd love to put it on display at the Adams County Historical Society. And a mother wore it at her wedding and gave it to her daughter, and she wore it at her wedding. And then when Reynolds' body was coming by, she wrapped it around his head. Later, he died. She went to the house. She took the shawl back, and it's in their family with Reynolds' blood on it. Wouldn't it be great to get the shawl and then clone General Reynolds? Okay, so I want that. So if you'd like to donate to the Historical Society, you can, whoever has it. They eventually put General Reynolds' body in a box that they got apparently from the stone yard on Baltimore Street. The Culps were making a coffin for General Reynolds, but never completed it. And according to William Storick, that uncompleted coffin would then be used to bury Jenny Wade. That's in his account. They took Reynolds' body down the Taneytown Road through the middle of the 2nd Army Corps as they were marching to Gettysburg. And I must have a dozen accounts where members of the 2nd Army Corps stop as Reynolds' body is going by, and they're just stunned. And they take the body to Taneytown and then Union Bridge. Yep. So if you for homework, go to Union Bridge, Maryland. You probably wouldn't want to spend much time there, trust me. I used to work there in Union Bridge, so that people there are like that. But Union Bridge, there's a railroad station, and outside of it, there's a plaque about Reynolds. They put him on a train, they took him to Westminster, and then to Baltimore. He was embalmed in Baltimore, and then they took him to Philadelphia at his sister's house. And of course, I'm sure some of you know the story. When he's at his sister's house on July 2nd, I would believe that would be, there's a knock on the door, or July 3rd maybe. There's a knock on the door, and it's Kate Hewitt. And she tells Reynolds' sisters that she was secretly engaged to General Reynolds, and as proof, she has this West Point ring on a chain around her neck. And the family embraces her. They take her in, and then eventually she does enter the Sisters of Charity at Emmitsburg and become a nun. But it doesn't last too long. She leaves, and you'll have to read the love story book to find out what else happens to her. But here's a photograph of Reynolds' family with Kate Hewitt, we don't know which is which, on November 11th, 1863, on a visit to Devil's Den. In 1886, they put up a monument near the spot where Reynolds was killed, No reason to believe they had any special knowledge of the spot. They said that Joseph Rosengarten helped them locate the spot, one of Reynolds' staff, but one of General Reynolds' staff that was not present when he was killed. Here's the committee of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association at the dedication ceremony, and that's William Tipton. He was on the board then. In 1871, they dedicated a monument to General Reynolds in the National Cemetery. Reynolds has a statue on the Pennsylvania Monument. There are, souvenirs made with General Reynolds' picture on it. Do you know General Reynolds' death is a relief on the New York State Monument up top in the National Cemetery? And of course, I have a whole video on this, but eventually the equestrian statue of General Reynolds is established on the First States battlefield. And if you look at Monuments Monday, I do a whole thing on it. Here's the dedication program of that monument. Henry Heide Cooper of the 150th Pennsylvania gives the oration. And remember, I mentioned Sickles is at the ceremony. Joshua Chamberlain is at the ceremony. And Reynolds in 1884, I believe, was given a statue in Philadelphia. So he has a statue in Philadelphia. Only one hoof of the horse is in the air, signifying he was wounded, not killed. You know that's not true, of course. And to further the history of General Reynolds, in 2018, during the parade celebrating the Eagles Super Bowl victory, his monument was surrounded by Eagles fans. You're supposed to laugh harder than that for that one. And, the one last thing I'd suggest is you could always go to Lancaster, and see General Reynolds' grave on July 4th. The 4th of July. He was buried. His body had traveled all the way to Baltimore, to Philadelphia, to Lancaster, and he's buried in Lancaster Cemetery in downtown Lancaster at the corner of Lemon and Lime Street. And it's not too far from the corner of Lemon and Lime. And currently, if you didn't know this, I just read about it, there's a movement to raise money to restore General Reynolds' grave. So it's not it's not too bad, but they're doing a revitalization of his grave at present. Okay. Well, thanks for listening to me. I know I went a little long, as I'm prone to do.